Persona 5 was one of my favorite games from the last generation. It was highly stylized, beautiful to look at and to listen to, and its sleek and clever gameplay design made all the little encounters that might feel unspectacular in any other JRPG feel like they were meaningful and weighty decisions. And the early palaces and villains that you face early on in Persona 5 were genuinely some of my most memorable and favorite gaming experiences I've ever had. Especially the first dungeon in Kamoshida. But I will admit, as the game went on, its story got more and more convoluted and frankly kinda stupid towards the end. And its later characters, especially the later villains, became less and less interesting as the game progressed. By the time I finished Persona 5, I thought that it was a wild ride, and I didn't regret going on it. But I was also kinda relieved it was over, because it was starting to drag on a little bit too long and wear out its welcome. So when I found out that a sequel to Persona 5 was in the works, and it was in a collaboration with Koei Tecmo, ditching the extremely refined and deceivingly fast-paced and energetic turn-based battles of the original game for 3D action RPG combat made by the people who make Dynasty Warriors, I was pretty skeptical. Koei has made many games I have loved in the past, but also many games I'm not that fond of in the present. And the main thing I dislike about their recent output is mainly their combat mechanics. Combat mechanics of a subgenre of games that they have essentially been remaking for about 20 years at this point, and have not only failed to move it forward, but actually moved it backwards in many ways over a long period of time. But I'm not here to talk about those games, I've already talked about them. Here's the link, click it if you want. Now they are making not a Musou game, but converting Persona 5 into an action RPG. No battlefields, no enemy and allied officers, no garrisons, etc, etc. So how does Koei handle that? Is it a breath of fresh air or an ugly Frankenstein's monster of a game? Well, I won't be fully answering that question here, because I haven't played the entire game the whole way through, but I've played enough to get a pretty good idea about how the gameplay mechanics, progression, and out-of-combat activities work. So, I want to talk about those here. I won't be talking much about story and characters and stuff like that, so you don't need to worry about any major spoilers if you haven't already played the game. Still, a very light spoiler warning for the game's first palace and what it looks like, and there might be a little bit of combat footage here or there that features one of the game's new characters. So keep that in mind if you want to go in completely blind. Maybe don't watch this video right now. That being said, let's talk about the gameplay. This is one of the most chaotic action RPGs I've ever played. At any given moment in combat, I've got to control one character, but I also have 3 other characters I could potentially be controlling, swapping to at any time without penalty or cooldown. Each of them has their own elemental strengths and weaknesses to consider. Same goes for the dozen or more enemies on screen, each of which could have 3 elemental weaknesses, but also 3 elements they resist or heal from, and they are all applying status effects, stuns, freezes, etc. And while all this is going on, every attack has a big visual effect that obscures the action and makes it hard to keep track of what's going on. This isn't helped by the game's messy visual design, stemming partly from what I think is just straight up laziness and lack of creativity. What do I mean by that exactly? Well, all of the game's enemy designs, and their elemental strengths and weaknesses, the status effects they inflict and are resistant to, are all lifted whole cloth from Persona 5. But I love Persona 5, so why is this a problem? Well, can you tell at a glance what this horse creature's elemental weaknesses are? What about this lady in the red dress, or this pixie? If you haven't already played Persona and haven't seen these creatures before, you can't, because their strengths and weaknesses aren't clearly signposted in their designs. Nothing about a big lady in a red dress says weak to fire and lightning. Nothing about this horse says weak to curse. This wasn't a problem in Persona 5 because that game was a turn-based RPG, where you could take all the time you needed to read an enemy's strengths and weaknesses. Even though other turn-based RPGs opt for the clearly readable monster designs, such as Final Fantasy, Persona 5 on the other hand can still get away with it, and that allows for a bigger variety in designs, I suppose, since you don't have to make all your ice types blue and fire types red, etc. But I can't stress enough that these monster designs and their elemental strengths and weaknesses were designed for a turn-based RPG. They were designed for a very different gameplay experience than what you have in Persona 5 Strikers. And here they've just lifted them and plopped them in unchanged without considering whether or not what works in a turn-based RPG works in a chaotic action RPG. It's a bafflingly lazy and immediately obviously glaring design issue. I want to compare this to a couple other action RPGs, Kingdom Hearts and Final Fantasy VII Remake. In Kingdom Hearts, you have enemies with elemental strengths and weaknesses, but they keep things much more simple. Enemies have one weakness and one element that they are immune to or absorb, and they make it immediately obvious at a glance. Fire enemies are red, ice enemies are blue, lightning enemies are yellow, nice and simple. And because it's simple, the action never needs to stop. You never need to stop and read what a creature's strengths and weaknesses are off a list, because they're all easy to track in real time. But that's exactly what you do in Persona 5 Strikers. To cast spells, use items, even fire your gun, you pause time, and in the case of spells and items, open up a menu and select from a list of commands. While you are in this menu state, you can read all of your enemies' strengths and weaknesses, but it's a little bit clunky. Enemies have to be in range of one of your spells for them to be highlighted for reading. But honestly, that's a minor gripe. There's a much bigger issue with how this is implemented. So like I said before, you want to cast a spell, you stop time. You select it from a list and then you cast it. Casting the spell doesn't resume time. Time is not resumed until after the damage is done, meaning as long as you have mana to cast spells or items to use, you can spend an entire battle in a time stasis selecting commands from a menu. It's almost like a turn-based RPG at that point, except much more clunky, and there's no turn order, there's just you taking your turn over and over again, and your enemy doing absolutely nothing. You are only limited by the amount of healing and mana refill items that you can take, and as we will get to shortly, there is zero shortage of those. Not totally opposed to stopping time and selecting from a list of commands in a game that is otherwise running in real time, but it should at least have some effort put into balancing the fact that I can stop time to cast spells. That way it doesn't feel like I'm literally abusing a game design oversight. Final Fantasy VII Remake has you slow down time to a crawl to select commands not just for the character you're playing, but other characters in your party as well. But you can't just do this anytime you want, you have to build up ATB. This powerful time stopping is a limited resource, and once you have selected your command, combat resumes, and you are not guaranteed success. Your character can be damaged and have their animation interrupted after selecting their command. There is a real risk-reward to using your abilities in Final Fantasy VII Remake. That same risk-reward is not present in Persona 5 Strikers. And Final Fantasy VII Remake was far from the first game to come up with some sort of basic semblance of balance for this kind of gameplay. It's present in other action RPGs and tactical start and stop RPGs like Baldur's Gate or Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, and it's been a staple of that genre for a long time. It feels like the developers of this game haven't actually played any of those games and haven't bothered to come up with their own solution. Another thing those games all do better than Persona 5 is handling your allies in combat. Like I mentioned before, you take a party of 4 with you into battle and you can swap between them at any time. And that's about where the design consideration for making this work begins and ends. Feels like very little thought was put into this aspect of the game. To start with, when you are not in direct control of a character, you can't do anything to give them orders or adjust their behavior, not even in a basic way. They don't cast spells, use items, fire their guns, they just kinda melee combo. And they also occasionally cast free versions of their spells, but they don't consume their resources. And this can actually be kind of abused, but another topic for another time. So fine, I guess they don't waste your resources, but they also don't seem to be very good at avoiding enemy attacks and spells. Even the very telegraphed ones. I often have to deal with my AI companions going down to some action happening off-screen in the middle of a chaotic mess of a battle, and a lot of the time, I don't even know what just killed them. I'm kinda stunned that they didn't come up with anything here. Maybe they should have taken a leaf out of Final Fantasy VII Remake's book and made it that they dodge and block everything they can while not putting out optimal damage, or something like that. You can't adjust their behavior in even minor ways like Kingdom Hearts allows you to. And there certainly isn't a Gambit system like Final Fantasy XII or allied AI scripting like you can find in Dragon Age or classic CRPGs like Baldur's Gate, etc. There's just nothing here. No attempt to come up with a design solution whatsoever. And this kind of laziness, it permeates throughout the entire game. It's not just present with the allied AI. Also, because spells, gunplay, and items are all used in a stopped time state, there's no potential to naturally combo multiple characters' abilities together. The only option for that sort of thing is these contextual commands such as the special action swaps or all-out attacks. You're not really doing any of these things, the game sets it up for you. You don't have a cool situation like you do in a game like Final Fantasy VII Remake where you can queue multiple characters' attacks and have them all land in one big combo. Everything here is very staggered and broken up. Swapping between your characters just teleports the character you're swapping to into your current position. So there's no swapping to a character in your party who is behind the enemy to get a rare attack or anything like that. Basically, the gameplay feels like two entirely separate parts that don't work together at all. You have the remnants of Persona 5, spells, items, etc., and then you have the real-time combat. It feels like no attempt was made to make these two things work together. In fact, the more I talk about this game's mechanics, the more I wonder why this game is even in real time. It doesn't take advantage of any of the dynamic action that a turn-based game can't. Frankly, as nice as the combat looks at a glance, thanks to the visual style of Persona 5, this game actually has some of the worst combat and gameplay mechanics for an action RPG that I've ever played. And so far, all I've been talking about is selecting abilities from a command menu. I haven't even started talking about the real-time combat. So the action that happens in real time in this game is where you see the basic bones of a Musou game. You've got your normal attacks, your charge attacks, your normal intercharge attacks, and then you have contextual follow-up attacks, all-out attacks, make a return from Persona 5 in a different form. and you build up a meter to unleash powerful, screen-clearing finisher moves akin to Musou attacks called Showstoppers. It's a pretty basic moveset, but I'll try not to be too harsh about that. I mean, the Dynasty and Samurai Warriors games aren't exactly known for their intricate movesets. That being said, I really do think more could have been done here. Like, why has every character got the same combo style? Why not have multiple combo styles like you have in Samurai Warriors? What about special attacks? Or weapon switching? Or active cooldown abilities that you use in real time? And what would have been much better is if spells and gunplay and items were not divorced from the real-time combat, but that ship has sailed. I just think it's pretty weak that this game has some of the most basic combat mechanics even for a Musou game, despite having one of the smallest casts of characters any Musou game has had. But okay, the inputs for the movesets may be nearly identical across all characters, but if the effect of their moves are different, then no problem, right? So, do the characters feel unique and distinct from each other in Persona 5 Strikers? Well, yes and no. To start with, your normal and charge attacks across all characters feel nearly identical. There isn't really any difference in reach or speed or damage whether you are swinging Joker's dagger, or Ann's whip, or Ryuji's bat. Characters also don't have a type or perform any particular role. There's no tank, healer, DPS party synergy stuff. There's no characters that are focused on range attacks instead of melee, or magic attacks instead of physical attacks. There's no characters that shine in aerial combat as opposed to combat on the ground, or characters that excel at killing strong individual enemies as opposed to killing big groups of enemies. There's no difference in the way characters move, even for a tiny character like Morgana. The only thing that sets these characters apart from each other is their elemental strengths and weaknesses, and their lists of spells, which, like I said before, is pretty much entirely divorced from the real-time combat. The characters do at least have attacks they can use in real time that are imbued with their element, and essentially cast weaker but free versions of their persona spells. And for Joker, who can pick any persona from the dozens, or if not more, available in this game, that means lots of different animations and attacks, which is nice and all, but doesn't make up for the lack of identity for these characters. They all look very different and have very different personalities, but they all play pretty much exactly the same. So, to be honest, the combat is a mess and it's not very good. But what about the rest of the game around it? After all, Persona 5's combat often boiled down to knocking all the enemies down in the first turn and then wiping them all out with an all-out attack. Persona 5 always felt fun because of how the rest of the game excellently complemented that pretty simple core gameplay loop. Unfortunately, while most of the combat and enemy design was lifted straight from Persona 5, most of that awesome social exploration and time management gameplay was left on the cutting room floor. You might be fooled by this game's intro, which shows time progressing forward on the calendar, into thinking this key feature from Persona 5 and other Persona games before it would be making a return here. But it just isn't. It's not redesigned or replaced, just straight up removed, and it really sucks. Always being on the clock in Persona 5 provided a constant sense of urgency, and that made the little things like going into Mementos and grinding a bunch of enemies and doing side quests feel like a challenge to see how many enemies I could clear and how much loot I can haul before having to return to the real world and losing another calendar day. And it made choosing which character I choose to spend my finite time with on any given day always feel like a meaningful decision and not an item on a checklist. Because depending on what comes up and how well you manage your time, you are never guaranteed enough time to do everything. Getting a 100% run in this game is a genuine achievement and requires you to have some knowledge of the game. That and the side activities, especially building bonds with this game's large and likable cast of characters, allowing you to explore compelling and endearing character backstories while also netting you a variety of cool gameplay bonuses, both directly in combat and indirectly, such as bonuses to help you make money or save time. All of that in Persona 5 was frickin' awesome. It's what made that game for me. It made Persona 5 consistently rewarding and addictive. And I'm harping on about it here because none of that smart game design carries over to Persona 5 Strikers. Annoyingly, this game fakes you out into thinking these cool gameplay features will be present, until you find out that it's nothing more than window dressing. The calendar only moves at specific and entirely scripted parts of the story. The game tells you that you earn bond points from social interactions, but you have no agency about when these social interactions happen. These social interactions are all mandatory parts of the main story, as far as I know anyway. Speaking of which, social links or confidants or whatever you want to call them are gone, and they are replaced by the previously mentioned bond points system. Rather than spending time with individual characters, being rewarded with gameplay goodies while also exploring backstories, we have points earned at set points in the story, but actually mostly through winning battles and killing enemies. These points can be spent on a list of perks, each of which have several points that can be put into them to empower them further. Gone are the thematic and niche bonuses like befriending your teacher, allowing you to skip class, or befriending the politician, giving you new negotiation options when fighting the enemies. Now it's just pretty uninteresting passive bonuses. +5 attack, +5 defense, fill up your showtime meter a little faster, make items drop a little more often. Spend bond points on this bond perk, which increases how many bond points you get from farming mobs. Not exactly the most inspired stuff. None of it really changes how you play the game, or opens up a new kind of playstyle, new options not previously available. It all is just passive stat bonuses. Like, speaking of farming mobs, with no calendar system, you get to just go in and out of the dungeon without losing any time. You even regain all your HP and mana when you do that. Hell, it even restocks some treasure chests when you go in and out of the dungeon. So now, any challenge that comes up in the game can be beat by just farming as many mobs as you want with impunity, allowing you access to essentially unlimited money and experience. And you can use that to stock up basically an unlimited number of healing and mana restoring items. And then you can basically just cast spells and replenish using items for an entire fight without the enemy even having a chance to respond. The exploration side of gameplay also suffers. You can go out to explore Tokyo, kind of like how you did in Persona 5. But so far, from what I've seen, there's no characters to meet or optional story content to partake in. There's stuff to buy, but it's not from shop owners with their own personalities and backstories like it was in Persona 5. It's all just vending machines and convenience stores with faceless clerks. So far, all these other vendors just sell healing items. There's nothing interesting like gifts or retro gaming consoles, etc. The last thing I want to talk about gameplay-wise is difficulty. So, all of my perspective of this game has been from playing this game on hard mode. And for the most part, like 99% of the time, Hard mode's an absolute breeze. This game's an absolute joke and easy to abuse. However, I did encounter the giant killer teddy bear and got a rude awakening with a completely unreasonable and unfair difficulty spike. Basically, this game's idea of difficult is to occasionally throw in an enemy that can easily be avoided, by the way, but this enemy has a bazillion HP. I have to hit it with its weakness like 100 times or something at my current level, while it can kill any of my party members in a single hit. By the way, this fight really showcased how bad Allied AI is. Constantly having teammates dying during this fight against attacks that I have no way to help them avoid. Basically, this is shit game design. This isn't really difficult, it's just cheap. Basically, the way to overcome an enemy like this is just to be patient and just grind until you're really strong, and to be fair, you probably can reduce the amount of level grinding you have to do by creating a powerful persona, one that's immune to all of its attacks and stuff like that. The same was kinda true of Persona 5 as well, but like I've already mentioned, that game had the calendar system. If there was a really powerful enemy that I needed to grind to beat, that felt like an emergent little gameplay factor. I had to find time in my calendar to beat that boss, and it felt like a cool problem to solve, whereas here it just feels like busy work. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is this game's story content. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to bring up any major spoilers for Persona 5 Strikers, but I will be spoiling Persona 5, so if you haven't already played the original game, skip ahead to this timestamp that I'll leave on screen, because Persona 5's a great game, and you should go play it if you haven't already, seriously. I'll admit, I haven't seen enough of this game's story to form a proper opinion on the merits of the story of Persona 5 Strikers on its own. However, I have to ask, was this game necessary? Persona 5 was a massive game. My first playthrough of it took about 120 hours. If I were to critique Persona 5's story, I'd personally say that it started out incredibly strong and slowly got less and less compelling over time. Don't get me wrong, most of its story arcs are still great. But to be honest, I could care less about Goro Akechi, the high school student / detective / talk show personality, and his plot to help Shido become prime minister so he can overthrow the current government to do some evil stuff, I guess. I'll be honest, I don't really remember what the point of Shido becoming prime minister really was. Just some big dumb conspiracy to do evil. And like, wow, shocker, the kid detective who spent the entire game talking about arresting the Phantom Thieves who joined the party pretty much by blackmail turned out to be a traitor? Wow, what a shock twist. Also, you and all the other characters have known about this since the start, but got given drugs that wiped your memory, but that's not really important, and what gave them away was the line about pancakes. Anyway, I'm not here to talk about Persona 5. My point is that towards the end of Persona 5, I feel the story was wearing out its welcome a little bit, for me. But by the time the credits rolled, I still felt incredibly satisfied. I went on an incredible journey. I both met and got to know a large cast of really endearing and compelling characters. And I engaged in power struggles that really strongly appeal to the core of my being, personally. And I got all of that in such a complete and comprehensive package. By the time I was done with Persona 5, it didn't leave me wanting more. I'd gotten everything I wanted out of the game. Which immediately for me creates a negative and maybe unfair bias towards Persona 5 Striker. Maybe it's completely unfair, but the first thing I think about when I think about Persona 5 Striker's story is just, why? Is this game necessary? Does it justify its own existence? And so far from what I've seen, the answer is no. It doesn't really justify its own existence, and it doesn't feel necessary. All the returning characters from Persona 5 already had their own arcs and character development. And it doesn't really feel like this game has much else to do with them. All of those bonds and relationships I built in Persona 5 are basically thrown away, since none of the progress and decisions made in that game carry over to Persona 5 Strikers. Which is probably why the social interactions in this game are so limited. For what social interactions there are, it's this weird situation where everything these characters talk about is related to and needs you to remember Persona 5 and its events, but it's always kind of tiptoeing around, like it doesn't want to get too specific because this game doesn't know if you had a 1-star bond with any given character or a 10-star bond. So instead this game's kind of written kind of like you have a 10-star bond with everyone, but it never addresses any of the specific things brought up that you would only know from having a high-level confidant with one of these characters in Persona 5. So if this game's story is going to be worthwhile, it needs to really deliver with its new plot and its new characters and places. From what little I've seen, I'm not really convinced. I don't like the first new party member they added to this game, and don't really care that much about this game's first villain. But like I said at the beginning, I'm very early on in this game, so maybe that could all turn around in terms of the story and the characters. And who knows what future palaces and villains and playable characters this game holds. But even though what I think of this game's story and characters could change, I feel like my opinions on the gameplay mechanics and features won't. I highly doubt this game is going to radically redesign its gameplay over the course of a playthrough, and I'm not sure I have the patience to wade through this game to find out if it gets better, either with its story or its gameplay. This game fails as a sequel to Persona 5. It's a hollow imitation of the original game, paying lip service to what made that game so great, while failing to deliver on what it teases you with. And that ultimately just makes me want to go back and play Persona 5 again. This game constantly reminds me that Persona 5 is a better game than Persona 5 Strikers. Persona 5 Strikers is also a poorly designed, barely thought out action RPG. It doesn't hold up to the best action RPGs out there like Kingdom Hearts 2 or Final Fantasy VII Remake. Compared to your average Musou game, it's got a much smaller cast of characters and a lot less replay value. To be honest, the only things about this game that I don't think are a disappointment are its visual style, its user interface, and its soundtrack. But that is mostly owed to Persona 5. Most of those things are just wholesale brought over. From what I've played so far, this game brings nothing good of its own to the table. It feels like a quick and dirty cash-in, selling a lazy and frankly almost unfinished feeling product off the back of the reputation of Persona 5. And for one of my absolute most favorite games of the last generation, I think it deserves better. If you're gonna do a sequel to Persona 5, do it right. Pretty down note, but that's where I'm gonna end it. I honestly struggle to play this game and write about it because I so strongly disliked it. To help me feel like my sacrificed spare time was worth it, please hit the like button if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe if you want to see more content. I've made the way I feel about this game known, but I'm very interested to see what you viewers all think of Persona 5 Strikers, if you've played it. Let me know in the comments if you enjoy this game or not and why, and if you are a Persona 5 or a Musou fan. This is GameRanker. Thanks for watching.